Donald Trump thought he could intimidate Canada with his latest trade war, but instead he just got publicly humiliated. In a fiery speech, Canadian MP Charlie Angus took the stage and tore into Trump's policies, exposing what he called a direct attack on Canada's sovereignty. So, what exactly did Angus say that sent shockwaves through North America? Why is Trump's trade war already backfiring? And could this be the moment that reshapes the future of U.S. Canada relations? Stay with us, because Canada's next move might just be the biggest political checkmate we've seen in years. What's happening? With unwavering confidence, Charlie Angus called out President Donald Trump's trade war as an attack on Canada's sovereignty. He lambasted Trump's aggressive economic policies, denouncing them as an attempt to bully a long-standing ally into submission. But Angus didn't just condemn the tariffs. He dared Trump to keep pushing. His voice rang through the chamber. "You do your worst, because Canadians will do their best." Within minutes, the speech spread like wildfire. Canadian citizens, business leaders, and political figures rallied behind Angus's words, while American media scrambled to cover the unexpected challenge. But while Canadians celebrated Angus's defiance, the speech sent a much darker signal to Washington. The U.S. government had assumed that Canada would play along quietly, that it would reluctantly accept the tariffs and negotiate behind closed doors. Instead, Angus had shattered that expectation. His speech was not just political posturing, it was a declaration of resistance. For Trump, this was an unexpected turn of events. He prided himself on dominating negotiations, making opponents fold under pressure. But Canada had just sent a clear message. It would not be bullied. But this wasn't just a speech. It was the first shot in an economic war that would shake North America, Trump's trade war. Donald Trump had built his presidency on an America First economic doctrine. Since returning to office, he had doubled down on economic nationalism, reviving the trade wars that had fractured U.S. relations during his first term. His administration argued that unfair trade practices were harming American workers, and the solution was simple: tariffs. With executive orders, Trump announced a sweeping wave of new tariffs targeting Canadian imports, particularly steel, aluminum, and auto parts, three industries critical to both countries' economies. The rationale? According to Trump, Canada was undercutting American manufacturing and putting U.S. jobs at risk. The numbers were staggering. The new tariffs placed 25% duties on Canadian steel and aluminum, and 10% on auto parts. Economists quickly warned that these policies could cause severe economic disruptions in both nations, but Trump dismissed the concerns. In rallies and press conferences, he boasted about his hardline stance, telling supporters that the tariffs would force Canada to negotiate a better deal for the United States. He even threatened additional tariffs on agricultural products, further escalating tensions. But behind the bravado, cracks were already forming. Business leaders, economic analysts, and trade experts were deeply concerned. Canada wasn't just another trade partner, it was the largest buyer of American goods. Any retaliation from Canada could send shockwaves through U.S. industries. But Trump underestimated Canada's resolve, and his actions triggered an immediate counterattack. Canada fights back. If Trump thought Canada would simply accept the tariffs, he was dead wrong. Within 48 hours, the Canadian government unleashed a counterattack, imposing billions of dollars in retaliatory tariffs on American goods. But these weren't random tariffs. Canada's response was precisely calculated to cause maximum political damage in the United States. The government strategically targeted industries that were vital to Trump's voter base. Midwestern agriculture took a massive hit as Canada imposed steep tariffs on U.S. soybean exports, directly affecting farmers in states like Iowa and Ohio. Key manufacturing hubs also suffered, with new duties placed on U.S.-made machinery and industrial equipment, hurting factories in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, luxury goods and beverages were directly impacted, as Canada slapped tariffs on Kentucky bourbon and Wisconsin cheese, two industries heavily reliant on Canadian buyers. The retaliation didn't stop at tariffs. Across Canada, provinces, businesses, and consumers united in an economic resistance movement. The Buy Canadian campaign exploded, urging citizens to ditch American products in favor of Canadian alternatives. Supermarkets removed American brands from shelves. Restaurants stopped serving U.S. beef and alcohol, and provincial governments canceled contracts with American suppliers. At the same time, former Prime Minister Trudeau's administration strengthened economic ties with Europe and Asia. Canada expanded agreements with the European Union and China, securing new trade deals that reduced its dependence on the U.S. market. Trump had expected submission. Instead, he had sparked a national movement. And while Canadians celebrated their resistance, Trump's own supporters were beginning to feel the consequences. As Canada stood firm, Trump's own supporters began feeling the economic pain. The economic backlash erupts in America. The backlash in the United States was swift and brutal. The very industries Trump had promised to protect were now suffering the most. American automakers, manufacturers, and farmers immediately felt the sting. With Canada imposing tariffs on American exports, demand for U.S. products plummeted. Factories that relied on Canadian suppliers faced rising costs, while farmers struggled to find buyers for their crops. Prices of cars, groceries, and essential goods skyrocketed. The auto industry, heavily reliant on Canadian-made parts, warned that Trump's tariffs could cause the price of American vehicles to increase by thousands of dollars. Farmers, many of whom had supported Trump in both elections, began speaking out. With China shifting agricultural purchases to Canada, American soybean and pork producers were losing billions of dollars in exports. Farm bankruptcies surged, and rural communities that had once been Trump strongholds grew restless. Even corporate giants were feeling the pressure. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis all warned that continued trade disruptions could force them to cut jobs and close plants. Executives lobbied the White House, urging Trump to reverse course before it was too late. But Trump refused to back down. At rallies, he doubled down on his nationalist rhetoric, insisting that the tariffs were necessary to restore American economic strength. He mocked Canadian leaders, portraying them as weak negotiators who would eventually cave to U.S. demands. As public frustration grew, Republican lawmakers in Congress began questioning Trump's strategy. Concerns over job losses, inflation, and economic instability fueled internal divisions. What had started as an aggressive trade stance was now spiraling into an economic crisis. As economic pressure mounted, Trump faced his biggest challenge yet, keeping his own base on his side. Trump's desperate reversal, or so it seemed. Sensing that his strategy was backfiring, Trump did something unexpected. He hinted at a possible rollback of some tariffs. During a White House press conference, he suggested that his administration was open to negotiating with Canada, claiming he had always been flexible on trade. The announcement sent shockwaves through political circles, with some believing that Trump was finally recognizing the economic reality. But those who expected a full reversal were in for a rude awakening. Instead of easing tensions, Trump used the moment to demand even tougher concessions from Canada. He insisted that Prime Minister Mark Carney agreed to stricter trade terms, including limitations on Canada's steel and aluminum exports, and increased U.S. control over North American auto production. He framed these demands as a way to restore fairness to the trade relationship, but in reality, they were designed to force Canada into submission. For former Prime Minister Trudeau's government, this was an insult. Canada had already made it clear that it wouldn't be bullied into an unfair deal. Trump's attempt to portray himself as the deal-maker-in-chief only reinforced Canada's determination to chart its own economic course. Canada, however, wasn't playing Trump's game. It had already moved on. Canada strengthens global trade alliances. While Trump was busy trying to reassert control, Canada was building something far more powerful. A new global trade network that no longer revolved around the United States. In the wake of Trump's tariffs, Canada had no choice but to look elsewhere for trade partnerships. What began as a necessity quickly turned into a strategic advantage. Instead of waiting for Trump to change course, Canada doubled down on international trade, striking deals with Europe, China, and Latin America, nations eager to do business with a stable and reliable partner. The European Union, frustrated with Trump's erratic economic policies, embraced closer ties with Canada. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which had already opened up massive new markets for Canadian goods, became even more critical. European leaders saw Canada as a preferred alternative to the uncertainty of dealing with Trump's America. Meanwhile, China, the primary target of Trump's trade war, wasted no time in expanding its economic ties with Canada. Beijing increased its imports of Canadian agricultural products, particularly wheat, soybeans, and pork, products it had previously sourced from U.S. farmers. At the same time, Chinese investors poured billions into Canadian infrastructure, energy, and technology sectors, further strengthening the economic bridge between the two nations. Latin America also saw an opportunity. With Mexico already frustrated by Trump's threats to scrap trade agreements, countries like Brazil and Argentina began negotiating new trade pacts with Canada, further reducing North America's dependence on U.S. economic policies. By the time Trump realized what was happening, the damage was done. Canada had diversified its trade portfolio so extensively that U.S. economic leverage was significantly weakened. Instead of relying on the U.S. as its primary trading partner, Canada had created a global safety net, one that insulated it from Trump's economic tantrums. Trump's economic grip was slipping, but his next move made things even worse. Trump's base turns against him. As Canada flourished in its newfound economic independence, the situation in the United States continued to decline. The very groups that had helped return Trump to the White House, farmers, blue-collar workers, and manufacturing employees, were now suffering the most from his trade war. American farmers in particular were reaching their breaking point. With China shifting its agricultural purchases to Canada, U.S. exports collapsed. Soybean prices plummeted. Pork producers faced mounting losses. And dairy farmers saw their markets dry up. What had once been some of Trump's most loyal supporters were now struggling to keep their farms afloat. Manufacturers were also feeling the heat. The auto industry, already struggling with supply chain disruptions, warned that Trump's tariffs on Canadian parts were driving up production costs, making American-made cars thousands of dollars more expensive. Ford and General Motors both announced layoffs, blaming the trade war for declining sales. Even small businesses, which had once seen Trump as an ally, were now struggling under the weight of rising costs. The tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel made everything from construction materials to household appliances more expensive. Business owners who had previously supported Trump's economic policies were now speaking out, calling on Congress to rein in the White House's reckless trade agenda. The shift in public opinion was undeniable. Polls showed that support for Trump's trade policies had plummeted, especially in key swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, states he needed to win in order to secure re-election. Sensing the backlash, Trump needed a distraction, something to shift attention away from the economic crisis and rally his base around a new controversy. But in classic Trump fashion, his next move only fueled the outrage even more. Sensing the backlash, Trump needed a distraction, but his next statement only fueled the outrage. The 51st state comment sparks outrage. In a rally that was supposed to be about economic recovery, Trump went off script. In a bizarre moment, he turned to the crowd and joked that Canada should become America's 51st state. The statement was meant to be a lighthearted jab, a way to mock Canada's resistance to his tariffs. But instead of laughter, it sparked immediate backlash, not just in Canada, but around the world. Canadian leaders wasted no time condemning the remark. Former Prime Minister Trudeau called it deeply disrespectful, while opposition leaders, both conservative and liberal, united in their response. Across Canada, political divisions vanished as citizens rallied around a single message: Canada was not for sale. The outrage wasn't just political. Canadian citizens took to social media in full force, mocking Trump's ignorance of history and geography. The phrase, "We're not your 51st state," became a rallying cry, appearing on protest signs. social media posts, and even merchandise. Canadian businesses doubled down on their boycott of U.S. goods, while anti-Trump sentiment surged to new heights. Even Trump's own allies in Washington cringed. Republican lawmakers, already worried about the impact of the trade war, distanced themselves from the remark. Diplomats scrambled to smooth things over, emphasizing that the U.S. Canada relationship was built on mutual respect, not annexation. And while Canada was more united than ever, Trump's own political future was growing more uncertain. With Canada more defiant than ever, Trump's next challenge wasn't just economic, it was political. U.S. businesses seek stability outside of Washington. As the economic fallout from Trump's trade war deepened, major American corporations found themselves facing a difficult choice: stay loyal to Washington's erratic policies or seek stability elsewhere. The decision, for many, became clear. They needed to look beyond the United States. Leading automakers, manufacturing giants, and multinational corporations quietly started shifting investments to Canada, hoping to shield themselves from the turbulence in Washington. With U.S. tariffs disrupting supply chains and increasing costs, businesses saw Canada as a safer bet. The exodus started with the auto industry. Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, companies that had long relied on integrated North American supply chains, began redirecting production to Canadian and Mexican plants. The reason was simple. Trump's tariffs on Canadian auto parts were making it too expensive to keep operations in the U.S. Instead of paying the added costs, manufacturers moved jobs north of the border, ensuring their vehicles could still be competitively priced in the global market. Tech companies followed suit. Silicon Valley firms with Canadian satellite offices expanded operations, while new startups looked to Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, fast-growing tech hubs that offered stability. With concerns about Trump's economic unpredictability and increasingly isolationist policies, businesses preferred Canada's more open trade environment. Wall Street took notice. Financial analysts issued warnings that Trump's aggressive trade war was not strengthening the U.S. economy. It was destabilizing it. Investment firms urged clients to diversify into international markets, with Canadian stocks and bonds becoming attractive alternatives. As uncertainty grew, some of the biggest names in American finance, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Morgan Stanley, warned of a potential financial crisis if trade tensions weren't resolved. But while U.S. businesses sought stability elsewhere, Canada saw an opportunity. As businesses turned away from Washington, Canada was actively shaping a new future: Canada's economic transformation. The crisis forced Canada to rethink its economic strategy, and the response was swift. Instead of waiting for Washington to shift course, Canada took matters into its own hands. The federal government announced a multi-billion-dollar investment plan to boost domestic manufacturing. Auto plants that once relied on U.S. partnerships were given incentives to expand production domestically, while tech and renewable energy sectors received a surge of funding to accelerate innovation. With U.S. businesses pulling back, Canada doubled down on economic self-reliance. The steel and aluminum industries, which had been hit hardest by Trump's tariffs, saw a government-backed resurgence. Canada increased production capacity and strengthened ties with European and Asian markets, ensuring that its industries would no longer be dependent on the United States. For decades, Canada had been seen as a secondary player in North American manufacturing, a country that supplied raw materials rather than producing finished goods at scale. But this crisis changed everything. Instead of being reliant on American companies, Canadian businesses expanded domestic supply chains, creating an ecosystem that could operate independently of the U.S. The transformation extended to agriculture. With American imports becoming less reliable, Canada ramped up domestic food production, expanding trade partnerships with Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Canadian dairy, wheat, and beef producers saw massive new export deals with countries eager to diversify away from the instability of U.S. policies. But as Canada adapted, cracks in Trump's strategy were becoming impossible to ignore. His advisors, once loyal defenders of his economic policies, began warning that the trade war was spiraling out of control. While Canada adapted, Trump's own advisors were warning him about the long-term damage. Is Trump's economic strategy backfiring? When Trump first launched his trade war, he promised that tariffs would bring back American jobs, boost manufacturing, and strengthen the economy. But by this point, those promises were falling apart. Economic analysts issued dire warnings. Trump's protectionist policies were not rebuilding U.S. industries. They were crippling them. Key U.S. sectors, including automobiles, agriculture, and manufacturing, were suffering under Canada's retaliatory tariffs. Instead of bringing jobs back, businesses were downsizing and, in some cases, closing altogether. The loss of Canadian trade deals meant that U.S. farmers had fewer buyers for their crops, and with China also turning to Canada for agricultural imports, the American farming industry was bleeding money. Major American manufacturers, once eager to expand under Trump's leadership, were now delaying investments and halting hiring. The price of raw materials had skyrocketed due to the tariffs on steel and aluminum, making production more expensive than ever. The biggest warning sign came from the auto industry. Ford and General Motors publicly announced that continued tariffs could force them to cut tens of thousands of jobs. Executives met with White House officials, urging Trump to reconsider his strategy. Behind closed doors, even some of Trump's closest advisors warned him that continuing down this path could trigger an economic recession. But Trump remains defiant. He dismissed the warnings as fear-mongering, insisting that his policies were working. At rallies, he mocked economists and corporate leaders, calling them part of the globalist elite, trying to undermine American workers. He doubled down on his claim that tariffs would eventually force Canada to surrender, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear. This battle was no longer just about trade. It had become a fight for economic power on a global scale. But what role would the United States and Canada play in this new economy? Policy reforms. Can the U.S. fix the damage? As the economic backlash from Trump's trade war grew, pressure mounted on Congress to step in. Lawmakers from both parties found themselves caught between two opposing forces: loyalty to Trump's America First policies and the undeniable reality that his tariffs were hurting U.S. industries. The auto industry, which had warned of higher costs and job losses, now demanded immediate relief. Farmers, who had once supported Trump, were pleading for an end to trade restrictions. Even manufacturing giants, some of whom had initially benefited from protectionist policies, were now lobbying for a rollback of tariffs. In response, Congress debated emergency trade policies. Some lawmakers proposed tariff exemptions for key industries to prevent further economic damage. Others pushed for legislation that would limit the president's power to impose unilateral tariffs, ensuring that future trade wars would require congressional approval. Additionally, there was growing support for incentives that would encourage companies to reshore manufacturing through tax breaks and infrastructure investments. While U.S. policymakers struggled to repair the damage, Canada was moving in the opposite direction, ensuring that no future U.S. leader could weaponize trade against them again. Trudeau's government responded with sweeping reforms aimed at making Canada less dependent on U.S. trade. New trade agreements with Europe, Asia, and Latin America were strengthened, ensuring that Canadian businesses had multiple international markets. At the same time, Canada invested heavily in domestic production, reducing reliance on U.S. supply chains for critical goods like steel, energy, and agricultural products. Additionally, Canada poured resources into logistics technology, making its economy more agile and resistant to future trade disruptions. These moves permanently altered the balance of power in North American trade. For the first time in modern history, Canada was strategically positioning itself as an economic force, independent of U.S. influence. While governments debated policy changes, the real power shift was happening at the grassroots level, farmer and industry-led solutions. As Washington and Ottawa clashed over trade policy, farmers, business owners, and tech entrepreneurs took matters into their own hands. Across North America, new independent trade networks bypassed government restrictions entirely, allowing industries to adapt in ways politicians had never anticipated. Farmers, who had been some of the hardest hit by the trade war, stopped waiting for government solutions. Many turned to direct-to-consumer sales, using digital platforms to sell their crops internationally without relying on traditional export routes. Instead of waiting for new trade agreements, they forged private supply chains with buyers in Europe, China, and Latin America, cutting out middlemen and reducing their dependence on U.S. trade policies. At the same time, cooperative business models emerged across industries. Small and mid-sized manufacturers formed alliances, pooling resources to keep costs low and reduce reliance on U.S. suppliers. Some farmers even shared equipment and distribution networks, allowing them to continue production without suffering under the weight of tariffs. Meanwhile, tech-driven supply chains provided real solutions to trade instability. Companies began leveraging AI to identify emerging markets, predict pricing fluctuations, and adjust production strategies in real time. Blockchain technology made cross-border transactions more secure and efficient, allowing businesses to trade without interference from national policies. These grassroots efforts didn't just mitigate the damage of Trump's trade war. They signaled a fundamental shift in how global commerce operated. The message was clear. Trade would no longer be dictated solely by governments. Those who innovated and adapted would control the future of the economy. But beyond business, one final question loomed. Had the balance of power in North America permanently shifted? Who wins the economic war? As the dust settled on the trade war, two competing realities emerged. On one side, Canada had come out stronger, more independent, and less reliant on U.S. trade. On the other, Trump was facing mounting economic and political challenges that threatened his grip on power. For Canada, the crisis had forced a long-overdue economic transformation. By diversifying trade agreements, investing in self-sufficiency, and leveraging technology, the country emerged with greater economic resilience than ever before. Canadian businesses, once deeply tied to U.S. markets, now had multiple global avenues for growth. For Trump, however, the trade war had not gone as planned. Instead of strengthening the U.S. economy, it had fueled inflation, hurt key industries, and alienated global allies. With midterm elections approaching, his political future was in serious jeopardy. His once loyal base, farmers, factory workers, and business owners, now felt betrayed. The auto industry was still struggling to recover from supply chain disruptions and price hikes. Farmers had lost billions in international sales as global buyers turned to Canada and other trading partners. Even Wall Street had lost confidence, with stock market volatility shaking investor faith in Trump's economic leadership. But the consequences extended beyond Trump's presidency. The entire structure of North American trade had changed. Canada and Mexico had accelerated their efforts to trade independently of the U.S., and global markets had adapted to a world where the United States was no longer the sole dominant force. As economic uncertainty loomed, one thing was clear: the old rules of trade had been rewritten. For Canada, the fight had proven that it could stand its ground, forge its own economic path, and thrive without relying on U.S. policy decisions. For Trump, the trade war had exposed the limits of economic nationalism and left his administration scrambling to repair the damage. Has Canada just rewritten the rules of North American trade? Will the U.S. recover, or is its dominance fading for good? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.